Hi, I'll pick up where I left off in the last video on the chapter on the brace from Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach's Versuch über die wahre Art das Klavier zu spielen. So this is not yet over. There is an appendix to this paragraph 24. But before I read, did anyone, while looking at the written out execution of example 2, think of this? The double dotted rhythm and its notation. The example up on the screen is the quarter note or the crotchet version of the double dotted rhythm. And the example 2 would be the 8-note version, in that where it's written out, the distribution is written out. How was the double dotted rhythm taught to you? What do the double dots mean? Why are they there? What does the double dotted rhythm represent? What are the issues with it? Where does it come from? I'm waiting for Lilliput's roll of honour to answer that. To think of all the things they said in their lessons, in their master classes that they've given. Already filling me in on what I don't obviously know in their minds. Even though I went through their education system. In example 2, you can see the 2 dots to which Bach referred in paragraph 24 when he said, in the case of C, there'll arise 2 dots between which the brace will be played. So where do the 2 dots of the double dotted rhythm come from? What I came to understand from my time going through the education system was that the double dot represented a different rhythm to that of the single dot. A rhythm that, from what I could gather from the example set by the world about me, hadn't existed before the introduction of the double dot. That it was a rhythm I'd sometimes encounter in Beethoven and Mozart, but not in the music of anyone earlier than that. That it was, so to speak, a new rhythmic innovation. But look at what Bach provides as the typical indication of that double-dotted rhythm. Gewöhnliche Andeutung, what's written there, means typical indication or usual indication. Or how the example 2 appears in the score. They both have the normal dotted rhythm with a single dot. The one used by people to whom the double dotted rhythm was supposedly unknown, if Lilliput's roll of honour and the example they set is anything to go by. I could imagine that anyone taking this seriously, anyone reticent to discard the things Bach is telling them, will be thinking of this when trying to work out the significance of what Bach said, or trying to align it with what they already know. That they'll be thinking of the double-dotted rhythm in connection with what Bach said in paragraph 14 on trills, for example, and how it all fits together. Wenn die letzte Note des Doppelschlages kurz abgestoßen werden soll, wie kann man dieses andeuten? Entweder dadurch, dass man zum Punkt noch eine Pause hinschreibt, A, oder dass man neben dem Zeichen des Doppelschlags ein Strichelchen über 2 Punkte beisetzt, B. Obgleich diese neue Schreibarten fremd aussehen, so sind sie doch nötig. Man kann nicht zu viel tun, den rechten Vortrag anzudeuten. Wenn ein Doppelschlag nach einer etwas langsamen Note vorkommt, wozu entweder 2 oder mehrere Bassnoten angeschlagen werden oder wozu statt der Noten auch Pausen gehören, a, so teilt man diese Note wegen mehrerer Deutlichkeit und hängt diese 2 Teile mit einem Bogen zusammen, damit sie nur einmal angeschlagen werden. Man sieht alsdann ganz deutlich, wenn der Doppelschlag eintreten soll. B. Außerdem könnte mancher Ungeübter mit dieser Manier zuseitig zuplatzen und wäre alsdann genötigt, nicht zu viel Zeit leer zu lassen, sie, wieder die im 10. Paragraph gegebene Regel, zu langsam vorzutragen, welches eine schlechte Ausnahme verursacht. First off, I would say there could be an error in the written out execution, and that the D and C of the brace should be 64th notes. And this example is written in the soprano clef. So on the stave, on the lines, it'll look like an F and an E, but it's a D and C. Bach says in paragraph 24, its distribution or division is always the same with such dotted figures. In that written out execution, there is 1 32nd note too many for the first 2 beats of that bar. The time value is exceeded by a 32nd note if they are not to be understood as triplets. Yeah, so just point that out, say that. So what is the double dot representing here for Bach? It is not representing a new rhythm or even a different rhythm to that of the single dot. This is, the breaking news. What it represents for Bach is a way of indicating that the last note of the brace shouldn't be held out, but rather short and detached, as would coincide with how a rest, like the one added to the first of the new edition indications at A, would influence the execution. So the shortening or of the last note, or the detaching of the last note, it would coincide with the indication where the rest is. It would coincide with how that rest there influences the execution. And this would be just like in the recitative example he mentions in paragraph 18 with regard to its execution. And I'm going to read now an extract from page 456 from the New Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians, Volume 1. And it says, the double dot was the invention of Leopold Mozart, who introduced it with the view of regulating the rhythm of certain adagio movements. in which it was at that time customary to prolong a dotted note slightly for the sake of effect. Leopold Mozart disapproved of the vagueness of this method and therefore wrote in his Violinschule, 2nd edition, Augsburg, 1769, "It would be well if this prolongation of the dot were to be made very definite and exact. I for my part have often made it so, and have expressed my intention by means of 2 dots, with a proportional shortening of the next following note." His son Wolfgang Mozart not only made frequent use of the double dot invented by his father, but in at least one instance, namely at the beginning of the Symphony in D written for Hafner, employed a triple dot, adding 7/8 to the value of the note which preceded it. First off, the appendix to paragraph 24 was something Bach added to that same paragraph in the 1787 edition of his Versuch, which was around the time he had met Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart in Leipzig, which had happened a few years before Mozart's death in 1791. Leopold Mozart's 2nd edition came out in 1769. Chances are Bach could have been as aware of Leopold Mozart's violin school as he was of Tartini's treatise, from which Leopold Mozart plagiarized, i.e. pretended to be the author of passages that had been written by Tartini. So he had passages in his violin school that Tartini wrote that Leopold Mozart pretended to have written himself. So Newgrove says Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart made frequent use of the double dot. But if it was customary to prolong the dotted rhythm, as Bach says in paragraph 14 from the chapter on trills, all the time, were Mozart using the double dot as his father intended it to be used, there should be, bar the occasional exception, nothing but double dots in his scores. So Bach said in paragraph 14, this springs from the performance of dotted notes, which will be handled in the last chapter, by means of which the following the dot short notes are always executed shorter than their notation calls for. Es rührt dieses von dem Vortrage der punktierten Noten, wovon in den letzten Hauptstücke gehandelt werden wird, her. Vermöge dessen, die auf die Punkte folgenden kürzen, allezeit kürzer als die Schreibart erfordert, abgefertigt werden. Where's the vagueness in that? Leopold Mozart disapproved of the vagueness of the method, but in his Versuch, Bach discusses and clarifies his stance on this topic in full, all installments of which I shall be providing on this channel and connecting together. So he discusses and clarifies his stance on this topic in full, yet displays no such reservations. So Bach has none of Leopold Mozart's reservations. Why is that? I know why that is. Anyone who has escaped the cage and exists in the world of music will know why that is. Is it because Bach knows too little? Because ignorance is bliss? Is it because Leopold Mozart knows so much more than Bach does about music? But I'll say this, to Leopold Mozart's credit, he didn't hold his son back. Through the lessons with Johann Christian Bach, Leopold helped Wolfgang avail of the best music instruction that can be gotten. So I say that to his credit. He didn't keep Mozart as his level. He let Mozart rise up. He didn't hold them back, so that was very good. Something Leopold Mozart can be proud of. Rather than talking about the exceptions of when said practice occurs, for example, Bach is going to be talking about the exceptions of when it doesn't occur. The double dot for Bach is to expand upon how one indicates the proper performance, den rechten Vortrag, on the level of articulation, whereas Leopold Mozart wants to reduce the double dot to representing mere rhythm, to cancel out its higher purpose, to fix something that didn't need fixing, if Bach is anybody to go by. In other words, Leopold Mozart was reinventing the wheel. It could appear like Leopold Mozart repurposed the double dot rather than invented it. He had it do what the single dot was already doing. Bach's understanding of the double dot has an extra dimension to it. Much of the difficulty in playing Bach, Mozart and Beethoven's music comes from the roll of honour's ignorance and consequential neglect of this. When you get your education from Lilliput's roll of honour, which is where we all get it, they are sabotaging your chances of success right off the bat. They are planting incorrect pieces into the jigsaw puzzle you are meant to complete, preventing any of the pieces around it from fitting. They are making the cage. They are cutting off your access to music, your connection to music. Because this goes beyond the question of style or historical performance practice. Any misunderstanding of the hop or skip is going to negatively affect the jump. And even if you do manage to scrape together a jump at the end, it's not going to be the jump it's meant to be. It's like 100 years ago, the principles of flight, they're not a question of taste or of time. They are eternal, and they remain as relevant today as they were when they were discovered, and they will 100 years from now they'll still be as relevant. What might change is how one can honor them, like the different ways in which they can be heeded or honored. But it's not a question of period or style or anything. These are the laws of music. And when the laws of music don't exist, you are in the cage where nothing exists. And I can name a difficulty. In Mozart's Fantasy in C minor, there's, after the D major section, Mozart goes into A minor. And it begins with the left hand with a dotted minim, or a dotted half note, followed by a quarter note, an F, or a crotchet. And Lilliput's roll of honour, their students in their teaching and all, they'll all be playing it incorrectly. They'll be playing it as it's written. And that rhythm does not set up the rhythm of that section, or whatever you want to call it. The only rhythm that sets up the rhythm of what's to follow is the double dotted rhythm, or the proper way to play the dotted rhythm. And you won't hear a single, the best the roll of honour can do is to not mess it up, to get through the notes. That's the best they can do. But they can never make it sound natural. They can never make it flow. And alone, like the amount of time that Lilliput, the roll of honour, are wasting. Alone in that, if you think of how long that section will be practiced, and how difficult that section is to get right, and how much metronome work will be done, because the rhythm every single person is being taught to play the rhythm wrong, and they will never be able to play it properly. And that's exactly the case, and they'll have wasted so many hours. All those hours spent on that passage have been, in fact, wasted. They are hours and days and months you'll never get back. And all because you were told, you were not given the proper instruction on how to play it. And had you been given the correct instruction, were Lilliput, were the roll of honour not so pathetic, you'd have that section down in no time at all. And if you use what I am sharing, AC fingering, finger position I've tried, and start following all these things, you will have that down as you sight read. Or maybe your second run through, it'll already be down. And my one, you will hear a rhythm that is the only natural presentation of that exists in the world. And I don't care. I'll say that. And it's there to be seen. And I won't be put out by people, by the pampered ear, who can't tell anything, who have no clue what to listen for, saying it's not, just because it doesn't sound the way, it's not played the way they're used to it being heard. You will not hear any of these so-called, whatever they're meant to be, these roll of honour people. They can't play it because it can't be played. It is doing something that doesn't exist in anywhere outside of the cage. And in the cage, it sounds crap. So there's a difficulty. Bach and Leopold Mozart do not represent the same line. They do not represent the same understanding of or insight into music. Bach makes no reference to Leopold Mozart having invented the double dot, nor does he see it as having that same purpose Leopold Mozart envisioned. Leopold's Mozart vision for the double dot, doesn't get a mention with Bach, even though it's 1787. 18 years after Leopold Mozart's second edition. Plus, one can see the origin of the two dots with what Bach presents. In 1753, he states unequivocally that two dots emerge. The first edition of Leopold Mozart's Violinschule came out in 1756, 3 years after Bach identified the two dots. Can Leopold Mozart's origin of his two dots be seen? Did he explain what gave rise to his invention? Does that claim sit well? Does Leopold Mozart talk about the dots like somebody who invented the two dots, or like somebody who's pretending to have invented the two dots? And Leopold Mozart apparently doesn't understand what the two dots represent. He doesn't understand that what he has done there was redundant. And he didn't... And why am I bringing this to your attention and not New Grove? How come it's me? New Grove is your champion. How come they so... I want to keep this quote from New Grove. It was at that time customary to prolong a dotted note slightly for the sake of effect, and compare it to Bach's treatment of the subject. As well, I want to return to them saying, Leopold Mozart disapproved of the vagueness of this method, and ask you how vague, once you've heard everything Bach has to say on the subject, that method was in actuality. New Grove belongs to the roll of honour. they are one of Lilliput's champions. Fake news, a misrepresentation of the reality. Can you see how inadequate their account of the history of the double dotted rhythm is? And I'll say that triple dot they talk about, I looked through the manuscript score of the symphony in D major, the Hafner one, and I didn't find it, the triple dot. I'm not saying it's not there, I'm just saying I didn't find it. It's funny how this remains the cutting edge, despite it being 2024. Over 200 years later, it still cuts into what's known. And if that's not funny, it's tragic. Bach's explanation of the double dot with regard to shortening the last note, detaching it, not holding it out, also provides a clue as to how the single dotted rhythm is to be performed, if the difference does not lie in its rhythm. One could look at how the normal dotted rhythm in Beethoven is often or generally accompanied with slurs, while the double dotted rhythm appears without them, at least in his earlier sonatas. You know, Beethoven will had to deal with Lilliput, and they will have, I don't think Beethoven minded Lilliput making fools of themselves, but I think there were certain things he couldn't stomach what they would have done with it, so he changed things accordingly to prevent it. Generally, I think he got a kick out of how Lilliput and its roll of honour humiliate themselves. Okay, I'll leave it at that for this video, and I'll pick up where I left off in the next. Thanks. Bye.